Good evening. We're going to get started with our session on tough feedback for clinical educators this evening. My name is Tisha Green. I'm the Assistant Dean for the Office of School and Community Partnerships. And to tell you a little bit about this session, our session tonight is actually based on the book Crucial Conversations. And this is really about how to navigate difficult conversations and how to give good feedback. And I've integrated some strategies that will help you do that a little bit more. So this is a little bit of information that I've shared previously, but I've tried to make this presentation better than I have in the past. So I want to start with this idea that communication is 7% verbal and 93% nonverbal. And this comes from Dr. Albert Morabian in his book, Silent Messages. And he found that 55% of a speaker's message is actually based on body language. And 33% is based on the tone and music of the speaker's voice. And actually 7%, only 7% is based on the speaker's actual words. So think about that in your daily communication with people. You know, you're saying words, you're communicating information, but actually only 7% of what you're saying is about the words that actually come out of your mouth. So when we think about giving feedback, think about that. Often we go into giving feedback as, often having a difficult conversation or a tough conversation. And sometimes when we do that, we approach those as crucial conversations. And not every conversation is a crucial conversation, but in a crucial conversation, there has to be three things. There has to be opposing opinions, strong emotions, and high stakes. And an example might be that you and your student teacher might have different management styles, and you notice that those styles might continue, your student teacher's management style continually sets off a particular student. Um, this could cause the student teacher to respond in a way that throws off the behavior of other students, or that student might throw off the behavior of other students. You're worried about the impact that it could have on your class once you take back over your class, and you've worked hard to build rapport and establish norms and classroom culture. Your student teacher, on the other hand, thinks that the issue is with just the different management styles that you each have. Um, so when you think about this scenario, what are the opposing opinions? What are the strong emotions? And then what are the stakes that are there for each of you? And when I think of it, you both might have different management styles. The strong emotions might be that you're thinking about the impact this is going to have on you when you take back over your class, because you've worked hard to build rapport with your students and establish expectations. Your student teacher might be thinking about the fact that, this is her grade. She or he has spent all this money trying to complete the degree and get licensed. And those are also the stakes. Your student teacher might be taking it personally, thinking that, you don't support him or her, or that you don't trust him or her with the students in the class. And there's a lot at stake, students, your student performance, your evaluation, your student teachers, completion of the program. So all three elements are there in this scenario. So there are three ways that you could handle that conversation with your student teacher. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to give them some feedback on that scenario. So you could avoid having that conversation. You could face that situation and handle it poorly, or you could face it and handle it well. And my goal today is to talk you through facing it and handling it well. But first, I want to talk about the influence of you as a clinical educator. So, what does the research actually say? So, clinical educators are the most critical factors relating to the success of teacher candidates. And the research does indicate that the clinical educator has the greatest and longest lasting influence, not only on the student teaching experience, but also on the success of the teacher candidate. So, let's get back to having that tough conversation and how we might normally react. So, in a tough conversation, we have a tendency to do one of two things if we don't handle it well. We tend to either go to silence or violence. And we're going to talk a little bit about what each of those are. So when we don't handle these conversations well, one way that we could approach it is with silence. And those behaviors are withdrawing, avoiding, or masking. And this might be when the issue is averted or diverted. Someone brings up something else. A form of silence could be telling a joke to avoid discussing the issue, or it could be like masking the problem as something else. So you might try to bring up a completely different issue or undercut the issue instead of addressing it head on. So think about a time when you might have experienced silence in a situation, or maybe you have been the person to show silence in a situation. So another way that this could be handled poorly is with violence. And violence is not the physical act of violence, but it's when the situation is played out by a person controlling or dominating the conversation by trying to get their way or trying to persuade others to take their side. So someone might go to violence when they label others, or they name call or attack others. Something to remember is that, others' perception is reality. So that's why body language is critical. Often silence and violence are noted in body language. Remember, we talk about our communication and that it's only 7% verbal and it's 93% nonverbal. So it could be looks shared among others, tone of voice, or volume of voice. Those are all forms of violence. So we need to think about why we have this reaction. It could be biology, surprise, confusion, or self-defeating behavior. And biology examples would be when we give into the physical reaction that the high stakes conversations create. So we have high adrenaline, there's blood flow, we're nervous, or surprise. Sometimes conversations that we have to have with people when we're giving someone feedback, something they do takes us by surprise, we're not expecting it. And, we have to react very quickly. And therefore, we become defensive or we're caught off guard and we don't have time to prepare. Or there's confusion. We're just confused by someone's behavior. There's not enough rehearsal time. And so that often creates this biological reaction. Or there's self-defeating behavior. So, we say or do something wrong in reaction to someone else's behavior, and it makes the situation worse. we know we can't come back from it, and then we know the relationship is broken. And that means the normal person turns into this person, the reptilian man. So there's another um, uh, option, the fool's choice. And we call it the fool's choice because we believe there's no alternative. Um, we don't necessarily agree with the outcome, but we go along with it because we fear that not agreeing would lead to further disagreement. Um, so we agree for the sake of agreement, um, or because we've given into the physical reaction of the conversation, but we don't necessarily have to give in to the fool's choice. There are other options. So I always believe that if we can get better at tough conversations, giving people feedback, these are things that will happen. We can have an improved career, strengthen relationships, improved health, and a better overall quality of life. But now we have to talk about what do we do to get better? Well, the first thing is you can't give people feedback if you don't talk to them. Even though we know that, you know, that communication is only 7% verbal, we still have to dialogue with each other. We have to have a good relationship in order to do that. People are more receptive to feedback when you have a good relationship with them. We have to think about the safety of others when we're giving feedback. And then we have to focus on what do we really want. So if you're going to give someone feedback, what do you want them to do with the feedback? What do you really want from them? What do you want for the relationship? So I think we have to think about all of these things. And we have to think about the person that we're doing these things with in order to make sure that we're having safe conversations and that we're giving good feedback. And one of the things that I always want to remind people when we're thinking about feedback or we're thinking about having difficult conversations is that, we can't focus on just winning. Um, and I think about just winning as that need to always be right. If we feel the need to always be right and not listen to the other person, then none of these things matter. We're not really in it for dialogue. We're not really trying to preserve relationships. We're not thinking about the safety of the other person, and we're not focusing on what the other person really wants or what we really want. We're just, there to try to prove that we're trying to be right. So, starting with dialogue. Um, Dialogue is a two-way conversation. It involves talking and listening, and not just talking to have a response or reaction to the other person. It's a constant feedback loop. And whenever you're talking to someone and giving feedback, you have to be open to hearing what the other person has to say. You also have to be willing to change your mind in theory about the person's rationale and reasons. And that's often difficult because when you're in a relationship, when you're watching someone perform, as in your student teacher teaching, or especially if it's feedback on you were late today, or we talked about you doing this and you didn't do it, you've already formulated a story in your mind and you're going with that story because you've just collected multiple pieces of evidence to prove that story right. But you have to go into that conversation and dialogue with an open mind. And you have to think about the fact that, number one, people make mistakes. You have to know yourself well enough to know, am I going to hold a grudge against this person? And am I going into this conversation with that chip on my shoulder? And what is my motive in having this conversation? Is my motive about being right? Or is my motive about trying to open up dialogue? open up the pool, come to a shared meeting, and, help this person be better. And so, one of the things I always say before starting dialogue, examine your motive, know what it is. Is my motive to support and help improve, or is my motive to be right and accuse? And that will come across in the 93% of your body language, and probably not necessarily in the 7% of your words. Your tone and body language will tell whether or not that comes across. So remember that relationships are at the heart. At the end of this presentation, you'll get links that tell you how to access your style under stress. But also think about, what are you behaving like you want? And know that the relationship between you and your student teacher is critical. When you provide feedback to your student teacher, you're navigating a delicate relationship, and it places you in the middle of many competing constituencies, and it's important to have a conversation with your student teacher about that. You are navigating, the student teacher, your colleagues, the school administration, parents, the university, and your student teachers have to understand that. And so you're trying to make sure everybody remains happy, that expectations remain high, and you have to let them know that you're there to support them, but you're also there to support a bunch of other constituencies. And so the relationship has to start with that conversation. And it's critical that you approach the conversation with, how do you receive feedback? Think about how you receive feedback. Everybody needs feedback. You give students feedback every day. And I often say, as educators, we're the best at giving feedback and the worst at receiving it. We all want to be perfect, and none of us usually are. So think about, asking them, how do you receive feedback, and what are you going to do with the feedback that you receive? It's a gift. Think about how frequently you give feedback. Are you giving it in varied ways? Oftentimes I try to not just give feedback verbally, but also in writing. And then, how often are you giving positive feedback versus negative feedback? So there are two types of safety I'd like everyone to think about. The first is mutual purpose. And mutual purpose is that belief that you care about the goals, and the motives of others. Like, we have the same purpose in mind. We're working towards the same thing. And mutual respect is that we both care and respect each other. And, a lot of times before you have a conversation about feedback, like, I'm here to give you feedback, it is so good to establish, here's the purpose of this conversation. And I just want you to know that I respect what you tried to do. I know you're working hard to establish that mutual respect and purpose. And, and remind them that you were in their shoes once before too. You know how difficult it is coming into this situation as an intern, not as the teacher of record, and you're there to support them. And sometimes, establishing mutual respect and purpose starts with questions. Do they understand the expectation? And it's just a way to ensure that it's a safe conversation, and that they can be open and honest about, well, I didn't know that I was supposed to have sub plans because I didn't know what should be in the sub plans. It's the school expectation. We have a lot of student teachers that often are spring student teachers that don't know that because they weren't there in the fall when the school actually, had like came up with the expectation for sub plans, and all of a sudden they have to have sub plans, but they just don't know what's supposed to be in them, and so they don't write them. So the other thing that is important when you have a critical conversation or you're giving tough feedback is to focus on what you really want. It's sort of like when you're, when there are things wrong, do you point out every little thing, or do you pinpoint, here are the 3 or 4 things that I really want to focus on? So you really have to ask yourself, what do I want for me? What do I want for others? And that could be the other person in the conversation. And what do I want for the relationship? And, that is both after and during. You can ask yourself, what should be better or different? When you think about what do I want for others, what should be better or different for the other person? And then what do I want for the relationship? What should be better or different for the relationship? And one of the things to think about as you're asking these questions is, don't turn yourself into the victim. You know, don't create your own helplessness, um, you know, and don't turn the other person into the villain. Don't make them the bad person as you're asking these questions, because then you'll never actually get to an answer and you'll never actually get to the true motive. Now let's talk about some dialogue strategies. So we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about state your path, but this is how you can actually, give feedback, how you can really talk to someone about, here's what I noticed, here's what I saw, and really make it about, the improving versus not, about them. And I've used this over and over and over again in my career as a principal, as I'm coaching people. Um, and it's called State Your Path. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what this is. But state stands for share your facts. You're going to start with the least controversial, most persuasive elements. And remember, facts are things that can be measured or can be observed. So an example would be, what's a fact about the temperature where you are? And if you say it's cold, can you prove it's cold? No, because another person could say it's hot. But if you say it's, 65 degrees, can that be measured? Yes, it can be measured. So when you're sharing facts, you have to share actual facts. Yesterday you came in at 8:05, or yesterday you didn't have, and you didn't have your lesson plan in on time. Last Tuesday, you didn't have your lesson plan in on time. Because you didn't have your lesson plans in on time last Tuesday and yesterday, I'm beginning to tell myself that, you're not prepared or taking student teaching seriously. So that's the story I'm telling myself. I'm sorry, I'm only one person. And so now I'm going to ask for their point. So is this the same, how do you see things? So I'm asking for their point. Is this the same way that you're seeing it? And I'm talking tentatively. At the beginning, I didn't talk as tentatively as I should have. And then encourage differing or opposing views. I'd really like to know, what's going on, because, this is not like you. This isn't how it was at the beginning. So those are some questions I would ask. But here's the thing. If you don't ask that final question, if you don't ask them, to offer an opposing view, what have you done? You have basically just said, I'm right. There's no point in dialoguing. because I know I'm right and nothing you say can change my mind. So, so remember here, you're giving feedback by saying, here are the facts. I'm telling myself this story based on these facts, but I want to know what's really happening. You're allowing dialogue. So there's only one other person on this call, but I want you to think of a time when you provided feedback. It could be to a student in your class and it didn't go well. And I want you to think of what were things that contributed to the conversation not going well. And I can think of lots of times I provided feedback. I was a principal, I was a teacher, I teach. I teach graduate students. I mean, I can think of numerous times that I've provided feedback and it hasn't gone well. Um, and so, I would say that, oftentimes there are opportunities where feedback has not been um, gone well. And so here is part of why that hasn't gone well. So we call this the path to action, the idea that our stories create our emotions and we create our stories. So basically, we see and hear something. So an example might be I saw and heard, a student not doing his work. I told myself that the student didn't care, was being lazy. And I got upset because I felt like the student wasn't taking, my class seriously, and I acted. I was like, if you're not going to do your work and take my class seriously, you can leave. And what did I fail to do? I failed to not, move to dialogue, ask questions. I didn't do this. I didn't do the very thing I just taught you, which was state my path. But here's the idea. What if I used the White Rabbit's advice to Alice, which is don't just do something, stand there? What if I actually didn't use my reptilian brain and not got all emotional about it? What if I used a different approach? It was the fifth time the student put his head down, but what if I thought, well, maybe the student didn't get any rest the night before, was dealing with a bunch of things at home? What if I really, thought differently about the situation? So if we use the state, we're actually, using our what skills to get to our how skills and using a completely different approach for supporting our stories and not using our emotions to tell the stories. So what I want to do in the final takeaway, because I hope that is a helpful strategy as we're thinking about how do we actually approach feedback and how do we actually use a skill to give feedback to a student teacher or a student or a colleague or someone in a very helpful way. I want to think about like how do we move away from these high stakes and opposing opinions and strong emotions into dialogue, because they're not going to go away. We're always going to have these things. We're always going to have difficult conversations, and we're always, going to have situations where we can't predict when they're going to occur. So there are some great resources available. That I will share at the end of this presentation. There's the Style Under Stress survey. There is the conversation planner. There's an article on crucial conversations in education. And then there's the crucial conversations model. Again, this is really about feedback and about navigating that feedback with student teachers. But one of the things I've learned is the more you have difficult conversations, the easier they become. You can't ever predict when you're going to have to give difficult feedback. But, the more you start with facts, the more you know, pose questions as questions, the easier this becomes. And the more your motives are clear, the better. So with that, um, unless there are any questions, I will say thank you for attending, and this will be available on our website. Have a great evening.